bring any of these doubts, any of these concerns and questions to the leadership? And then if so, how was that handled? What were some of the things while you were still a member, what were some of the things that you started to see or experience that made you really start to doubt and question?
Yeah. So one of the biggest things was the questions that I had really were circulating around, for one, there was doctrinal aspects to it, and then there was experiences that I had that I thought this isn't right, or this isn't correct, or this isn't ethical at all. On that front, the ethical portion of it, I think there was someone who had shared, I think, their story on your platform about being in South Africa and having been asked to do certain things that were just completely outside of his comfort zone, and he realized like this isn't right. You know what I mean? And so one of those experiences for me was while being a group leader, I had a group member whose family lived in a different country. And they were pretty ill. They weren't doing well. And so she was just letting me know that I think in the next couple of weeks, I might need to go see my family because this might be the last time I see them. And so in my mind, I said, of course, absolutely. Like, you have to go. You have to go see your family. And so I didn't think this was a problem. And I was reporting this information up to my leader and saying, hey, just so you know, this group member is probably going to go see her family who's really ill and they may not make it. And I was met with discipline. Like, how could you as a group leader, don't you realize she's a newcomer? She just came. And so this could really have an impact on her faith. And how could you say that this is okay? Have you already given permission? And I said, well, of course, like her family, like this is her family member. Of course I would want her to go and say her goodbyes and see this family member. It was a problem. And she told me then, she said, my leader was like, well, what would you do? And I said, I would go see my family. And this was one of their, like, I think red flags of like, okay, Reddy's not truly like, you know, there's a problem here. She's not, so there was instances like that a lot. There's an event where someone tried to take their life at one point where it was very jarring for me to hear about that. And it kind of makes you question a lot of things when you start to see and hear these things happening, and the lack of attention that it's getting, and how they're going about addressing these issues. There's different kinds of abuse that have happened to people that I know. So it's tough when you see it and when you hear it, and it starts to kind of that cognitive dissonance where you're like, there is something really not okay here, you know, and I was getting to the point where I was thinking to myself, like, not knowing this was actually like, you know, false completely, and the doctrines were all false. Just that alone was beginning to really challenge me as a person. And I was like, how far am I willing to go? Right. And seeing these things happening wasn't okay. And I think in the doctrinal aspect, it was very obvious that I didn't sit well with me, right? The gospel that I knew growing up as a kid and as a young adult, like, while I was not like a Bible pro, knowing verses back and forth, I knew that, like, I was saved through Christ, in Christ alone, right? And I would always ask questions like, so does what Christ did just not matter anymore? Like, I was always just like, we're so focused on, they would say, he's the roadmap to what's fulfilling today, right? And I'm like, but the cross, like the blood, like, you know, and I would just say, what happens to that time that we're just trampling on to say that, like, this is just a roadmap to where we're getting to now? And that was very just, it didn't make sense, right? And so I thought to myself, when Jesus came, like, he found his people in so much burden. Not only were they following the laws, like, the leaders at that time had added on to those things. There was hundreds of laws that they had put on these people, and he said, rest. I am here now. Like, those are not things they needed to do anymore to be saved, right? And what it felt like we were doing in SCJ was going backwards in a sense of these, like, Jesus has already come, died on the cross, and told us that through him is how we can be saved. And all of a sudden, we had all these rules and these regulations and almost this fear that we had, and we had to follow these things. Otherwise, this could be tampering with our salvation. And I just thought, how odd is that? Like that Christ came to fulfill the law, of course, and then point us to him. But now we were in this, it almost feels like confinement, where if we don't perform a certain way, we're not saved. And so, and then of course, COVID-19 came, and the doctrine shift had me, for sure. That was one of the biggest red flags. And I thought, there's something truly wrong, because no one was really answering that question for a lot of people in terms of fulfillment. And then eventually I had access to previous books that Lee Man-hee wrote, which is really interesting. And a lot of times a lot of the members here, at least in the States, don't have access to those books for a reason, because things have changed in those books. And they don't want members.
That sounds very familiar. Yeah.
Yes. And so how he says that he's seen the fulfillment of Revelation happen, and yet there's so many different doctrinal changes. There are literally characters in Revelation who they say are a certain person have completely changed. And they just say, well, as his memory is more clear and as he remembers more things, we adjust them. But no, like it's not that. And so when I was reading them and realizing that there's a difference, there's a contradiction here. And I thought, yeah, like it's obvious why they weren't allowing us to have access to these books. And so, yeah. So
these books, are these, I'm just guessing that some who might be members or people coming out, I think, would be interested in getting a hold of these themselves, because I think so many people in these groups are kind of like they're on the fence in so many cases, where it's like, well, if I could just have something to just confirm that this is, all a sham, if I could just see that these things you're saying about the books, there are changes, then I could just know that, yes, I need to leave. But so many people are just kind of on the fence of like, well, is this really, is it not? And so is there a way we could like put links even in the description of the video?
Yeah,
where
we can, and I can send
look at those themselves?
Yeah,
great. That would be awesome.
Been posted on some groups that were like private, just because for obvious reasons of the group. But yeah, there's access to those books so that you can go in and read for yourself and see for yourself that there are changes that have been made to the doctrinal teachings. Yeah.
So when you did you bring any of these doubts, any of these concerns and questions to the leadership? And then if so, how was that handled? Yeah.
So initially when I started having questions, we would have group meetings where I had a group leader and where there are other people present where I would ask these questions, right, openly. But then I was told very directly that like it's best to have these questions and ask them outside of group meeting time, because everyone has a little different level of faith and it can impact them negatively. So I took that to heart. I said, okay, I guess I understand the concern. And so with certain times that I had with my own group leader where we would discuss things, I would ask questions and I would say, well, it didn't really, like, for example, make sense to me here when we were talking about it in Revelation, especially the COVID time, but even prior to that with certain lessons that we've had. And it's going to be reported up and we'll give you the answer. The answer never came. Like, it just doesn't, and also they would host these Q&A, they would call them town halls. And this was mainly during COVID when we had like Zoom calls, and they essentially would say we can ask, and if most people know town halls, you go and then anyone is free to ask the questions that they have, right? But they would ask us to submit these questions ahead of time. And then they would pick from those questions and answer them, right? So it's not truly like this open and like ended, conversation. It's more so they have the time to come up with any sort of explanation that they would like to. And so I had submitted questions on some of those things that were not picked as well. So it's a very interesting place. They'll never come up front and say like, we don't We never say that people can't ask questions. We never do these things. And of course they will. And I would be shocked if they actually admitted some of the things that we're saying they do here, right? But yeah, they don't really address them. Some things they do, and they'll spin it to, depending on your question, right? If it's like a, you know, just a general faith question or like revelation fulfillment related question, they might address those things. But yeah, no, I definitely had asked, because I was really grappling at what point about whether this place was legitimate or not, you know, because so, and after dedicating 5 years, I was like, if I'm throwing something away, like I need to know I'm really moving on from something that's false. You know, I've dedicated a lot of time here. And so that was where a lot of those questions were coming from at that point.